Now, we're going to jump into a bit of literary analysis, but before we hop right in talking about Rip Van Winkle, we are going to just cover a couple, uncommon vocabulary terms that are used in the text, such as obsequious. You probably already knew what that meant, but for those of you who don't, servile. Conciliating, past participle of conciliate, which is a verb meaning to appease or mediate. Termagant, which is a noun. It's an overbearing, harsh-tempered woman, or, according to Greek mythology, a deity of violent character. So, whoever is being described that way is probably not in a positive light by the person describing them that way. Insuperable, you probably already knew that just by looking at it. It's an adjective meaning insurmountable. Assiduity is a noun meaning constant close attention to what you're doing. Rubicund, it refers to, you can kind of guess, ruby, red face. Halu, we don't really use it anymore, but it's a verb meaning to call out. Alacrity is a noun meaning brisk and cheerful readiness. Peal, noun meaning a chime, a shriek, or a rumble, or as a verb meaning to chime or to rumble. Azure, which is, a pretty nice adjective to use, meaning sky blue. 10 more. We got uncouth, which means uncivilized. Roister, which means to revel or engage in noisy merrymaking, which is used to describe the crew of the Half Moon. We'll talk about that later. Addle, verb meaning to confuse, or, oddly enough, concerning an egg, to be rotten or not have a chick. Connubial, conjugal relating to marriage. Apropos is a preposition meaning with reference to, concerning, or as an adjective meaning very appropriate to a particular situation. So sometimes you hear that word used in analyses. It's a very useful word for those. Austere, adjective, severe, strict, not really liking any luxuries, unadorned. Ascetic, which is an adjective meaning one who practices severe self-discipline. Bilious, an adjective affected by or associated with nausea or vomiting, or oddly enough can mean spiteful or bad-tempered. Then you have impunity, which is a noun meaning exemption from punishment, and drought, which is probably one of the more interesting words that I looked up. It is the British spelling of the word draft, which could mean, traditionally, a cold burst of wind, but it could also mean a swig or a serving of a drink. It could mean the act of pulling a heavy load, or it could even be the depth of a ship below the water's surface. Now, let's get right into the text. Rip Van Winkle. General plot, for those of you who do not know or just want a little quick recap. Rip Van Winkle is a very idle man. He doesn't like to do a whole lot of work around his own farm, but he likes to do odd jobs for other people. So other people like him, but his own wife, not so much. She's very upset with him because he avoids responsibility at all cost. So one day he goes squirrel hunting with his dog Wolf, and he finds a stranger who calls him by name to help him lift a keg. He helps the stranger out, brings it to this group of gentlemen, takes a swig from a flagon, which, for those of you who don't know, is simply just like a beer mug, something that alcohol is served in. He takes a swig from that. He keeps going, and then eventually he passes out drunk. He knows his wife's going to be upset, but when he wakes up, he has a long gray beard, and a lot of time has passed. He has woken up after the American Revolution has taken place. Before that, there was no dissension at all, and people were still loyal to the crown. So afterwards, he comes into the village, sees everything has changed, things have to be explained to him, and eventually he lives with his daughter where things are explained to him, and he continues on with his idle ways. Now, this is referred to as an out-of-time story. Now, there are a lot of popular examples used in media. So the reference that I have right here is Encino Man, which some of you may or may not have seen. Basically, a caveman gets thawed out and he has to be taught how to do things in the Rock Age. Also, Blast from the Past is another example. This type of storytelling is a creative way to tell something about something historical. Yeah, and that relates back to that historical romance that I mentioned earlier when he made his works about Columbus. Now, Rip Van Winkle, the setting is a real place. He wrote it when he was homesick in Birmingham. He wrote it around Manhattan, but obviously I have this nice little circle right here. It's not quite precise, I'll admit, but here you have the Hudson River, and you have the Slide Mountain Wilderness. Now, the reason I drew my circle around there is you can base somewhat of an assumption that a lot of cities are based around bodies of water, and this one, no exception. So it was probably around where Shokin is, and he mentions in the text, great sight of the wilderness, as well as being on one of the highest peaks on the range of the Catskill Mountains. So, based on that, because the highest peak is in the Slide Mountain Wilderness, that's where I drew a basis for this region. So, that's roughly where it is. He spells it in the text, Catskill with a K and two A's, but the more modern spelling is just Catskill as you see it on the slide. Referred to as the Fairy Mountains, so a very mystical place. So it was inspired by his time in Tarrytown, although he admitted at the time he had never actually been to the Catskill Mountains. Moving on, let's talk about some characters. So Rip Van Winkle is our protagonist, the main guy, the main focus of the story. He avoids all responsibility at all costs. He likes to be idle. He's described as having an insuperable aversion to all kinds of profitable labor, which is a bit of a funny description, a nice wording from Irving there. Wolf is his dog, takes after his owner, and gets yelled at by Dom Van Winkle as well. Dom Van Winkle is his wife, described as termagant, which we will define later, or if you remember from before, an overbearing, harsh-tempered woman. Let's see what else. Rip Van Winkle Jr., his son, is described literally as the ditto of his father in the text. King George III and George Washington. I think it's important that they have similar names, one being before the American Revolution, one being after, to distinguish the time periods, but juxtapose them to each other. Derek von Bummel is the schoolmaster. He frequents the local inn. He has a lot to say about the newspapers that drift through. Nicholas Vedder, he is the patriarch and the landlord of the inn. He has a lot of adherents, a lot of followers, and they base his opinions based on the frequency and intensity of his pipe smoking, which is a trope that has been used in other stories, such as in The Hobbit with Gandalf. Let's see, who else is there? We have the stranger with the keg, who we later find out is actually Hendrik Hudson, a real historical figure. We'll cover him a little bit later. But basically, he calls for Rip by name, which terrifies Rip when he's going squirrel shooting. And then we have the Dutch clothing and grizzled appearance of Hendrik Hudson as well. Company of odd-looking personages. Otherwise, crew of the Half Moon, which we find out later, is a bit of a standoffish group that Rip encounters when he follows the stranger with the keg, Hendrik Hudson, to an amphitheater-like place. Now, it is not exactly an amphitheater. It is based around the general shape of the terrain. Now, if you look up here, I'm not sure if you're going to be able to see it, probably on the slide itself, but in Greek and Roman architecture, it's an open, kind of circular place that's surrounded by almost a wall that's kind of like an auditorium. Now, let's talk about the characters after the time change. We have Jonathan Doolittle. Doesn't have a lot of importance as far as interacting with the story, but he is the new landlord of the inn. Strange group of children. They alienate Rip. Kind of a minor set of character. orator and short but busy fellow, also not as important of a character, but we do find from these characters that people around the time when Rip returned to his village, people are very eager to talk about political stuff, and they want to find out what Rip's political association is, whether he's a Federalist or a Democrat, and understandably, Rip has no idea what they're talking about because he's been asleep for all that time. Now, a more important character would be the self-important old gentleman. He's not formally named in the story, but he is the one who restores order in the crowd that's surrounding Rip and accusing him of being a Tory and a spy after he says, "I'm just a loyal subject of King George III, God rest his soul." I think that's how it's worded in the story, but he's able to clear things up, and then we get to some different characters like Brom Dutcher, who wasn't mentioned, although he is technically a character before the time change. Rip mentions him asking, "Where is he?" As well as asking, "Where's Nicholas Vedder? Where's some other folks?" And he was most likely an adherent of Nicholas Vedder, and he is said to have fought in the American Revolution and died. They can't agree exactly how he died, but one thing that they do generally agree upon is that he did die during the Revolution. Then we have Judith Gardenier, which is Rip's daughter, who catches him up on what has happened since the time he's been asleep. She also is the one who takes him in at the end of the story, kind of catches him up on everything. And Rip, at the very end, lives with her and her husband, after whom she got her last name, after the name change. Peter Vanderdonk, by the way, very strange name. I'm not even sure if I'm pronouncing that name correctly, but that's just what it looks like, Vanderdonk. He's the oldest member of the village and a historian descendant. Now, it's worded just like that in the story. He's a historian descendant. It never explicitly states that he is actually a historian, but he is the one who recognizes Rip and is able to clear up Rip's story and explain to everyone else that his story is legitimate. And he's also the one who explains the story of the Half Moon Crew and Hendrik Hudson. Now, I have a picture right here. This is obviously filled with caricatures. Hendrik Hudson and his crew were real people, and they definitely did not look like that, although this depiction does have some strange looking Dutch clothing on these characters, which I think is more important. So now let's go over some key quotations from the text. Now, this is the wording from the copy that I have from this book. By the way, big recommendation. Does have a few typos here and there, but you know, for a price like that, you can't really beat that. So Rip's village is a little village of great antiquity, having been founded by some of the Dutch colonists in early times of the province, just about the beginning of the government of the good Peter Stuyvesant. That pronunciation may be a little bit off, but Peter Stuyvesant was an important historical figure. He was a director general who founded New Amsterdam, which now we know as today as New York. And he expanded all the way to Manhattan. So he has some historical significance with where Washington Irving was from. Let's see, what else? He was anti-Semitic and opposed all other religions. Now it's important to mention here that he's anti-Semitic because he not only opposed them religiously, but also as a race. So, not a very likable guy. But he opposed all other religions than the Dutch Reformed Church, which was a form of Protestantism, pretty popular at the time. His appearance, I think Irving chose very intentionally. It could signify the embodiment of one of the reasons why people left Europe in order to come to America as colonists, because of religious persecution. He is essentially the embodiment of religious persecution. And he is only mentioned in the first half of the story, which I think is also pretty important. He was one of the founders, but he does not play a role after the time change. There we go. So I have a nice little exact definition of termagant right here, which relates to this quotation here. A termagant wife, therefore, because of their lecturing, in some respects, be considered a tolerable blessing, and if so, Rip Van Winkle was thrice blessed. Now, this is pretty much a direct insult towards Dom Van Winkle, saying that she is 3 times as harsh as all the other housewives of the time. It's a brief description to help you appreciate, the level at which Rip avoids responsibility, despite the fact that there are going to be some really harsh consequences. He still doesn't like to take after his own place. And that brings me to the description of Rip Van Winkle. Very important description. Rip Van Winkle, however, was one of those happy mortals of foolish, well-oiled dispositions, who take the world easy, eat white bread or brown, whichever can be got with the least thought or trouble, and would rather starve on a penny a day than work for a pound. Now, this is a very important description of him, and like I mentioned before, an insuperable aversion to all kinds of profitable labor. Moving on to the next key quotation. Though rather shy and distrustful of his new acquaintance, referring to Rip not trusting Hendrik Hudson, the stranger who called him by name, Rip complied with his usual alacrity, which we defined earlier, a brisk, cheerful readiness, so he really just hopped to it. To help Hendrik Hudson with the keg, and mutually relieving each other, they clambered up the narrow gully, apparently the dry bed of a mountain torrent. That's on page 5 from the copy that I have. It sets the stage for the events that take place. Without this stranger's interaction with Rip, there would never have been a time change for Rip. That brings me to when Rip returned, the very village was altered. It was larger and more populous. He found his house gone to decay. The roof had fallen in, the windows shattered, and the door off the hinges. That's on page 8, a little bit later. Now, the door off the hinges could represent this being a new America. If you don't have a door, your house is going to be very open, free. Although that is taking a little bit of artistic liberty to describe it that way. But anyway, regardless of that, it's describing the changes that have resulted from the American Revolution, all the building up of new houses, a very significant part of the story when Rip does return for the first time. Moving on to our next key quotation. This one's a bit of a longer one, but it is very important. It describes the background of Dutch folklore that inspired his story of Rip Van Winkle. So, reading a little bit. Peter van der Donk, a historian descendant, recollected Rip at once, recognized him, and corroborated his story in the most satisfactory manner, made his story legitimate. He assured the company who had been accusing Rip that it was a fact handed down from his ancestor, the historian, that the Catskill Mountains had always been haunted by strange beings. That it was affirmed what the great Hendrik Hudson, the first discoverer of the river and country, kept a kind of vigil there every 20 years with his crew of the Half Moon. There you go. So that's the background. Now let's talk about him historically. Henry, otherwise known as Hendrik Hudson, was a Dutch explorer around 1565 who disappeared, and we even have the exact date, on the 23rd of June, 1611. Now, it was never reported, when he died, but we do know when he disappeared, and we'll find out a little bit why. He was on a mission to find the Northeast Passage to Carthage, which is modern-day China. Now, I do have a picture right here, thanks to Susie Harder, props to her, of the Northeast and Northwest passages. Now, he was trying to get to the Northeast Passage. Essentially, the passage just went through the Arctic. When he tried to get back after landing in New York, he tried to find the Northwest Passage in order to kind of get back on track. And he ended up sailing up the Hudson River, which was named after him. Now, after a harsh winter, he tried to press westward even more, and his crew mutinied him for that. Not all of them, but most of them. 7 of them stayed loyal, as well as his son. And after being mutinied, they were all cast off, the Hudsons, and the 7 crew members. Sorry. So in total, 9 men were cast off the ship that was called the Half Moon, which is where that name, Crew of the Half Moon, comes from. At first, when I was reading it, I didn't know the background. I just assumed, oh, maybe it's just a cool name, maybe it's referring to a lunar cycle. No, it is literally based on the ship's name. So, after being mutinied, that's, the date he disappeared. And the legend around the Hudson came from that story, because he was never found. So they assumed, for things that, when people disappear, they just assume, oh, they turned into a ghost and now they haunt the place. That was a general, pretty thing that happened at the time. Pretty general thing that happened at the time, anyway. Next key quotation. Towards the end of the story, how there had been a revolutionary war, that the country had thrown off the yoke of old England, and that instead of being subject to His Majesty, George III, he was now a free citizen of the United States. Rip, in fact, was no politician. The changes of the states and empires made but little impression on him, but there was one species of despotism under which he had long groaned, and that was Petticoat Government. Now he could go in and out whenever he pleased without dreading the tyranny of Dom Van Winkle. So Irving chooses his wording very intentionally here, using terms such as despotism and government and tyranny. Despotism, for those of you who don't know, is the exercise of absolute power, usually in a cruel and oppressive way. Now that would, pretty accurately describe the British taxation on the American colonists after the salutary neglect, not interacting with them for such a long period of time and then trying to enforce all these rules at once. It was very taxing on the American colonists. And then, like I mentioned, Petticoat Government was the term that he used, and I didn't really know this when I was going into it, but Petticoat Government refers to women being in charge of politics or domestic affairs. So he's describing despotism, petticoat government, and tyranny, all referring to Dom Van Winkle. And I think this really illustrates the point that Dom Van Winkle is supposed to represent the British, the old ways. Now they're gone. He's not being yelled at anymore, and now he's more free. So, what are the implications and takeaways? Like I just mentioned, the British, probably represented by Dom Van Winkle, but let's look at a couple kind of key quotations towards the beginning of the story. Authors tend to do this where they hide something towards the beginning and then it's revealed at the end what they meant by that, or, it reveals something deeper based on what you know about the history around the literature. So, Rip declared it was of no use to work on his farm. So it describes, he has a lack of care for his own place. You could translate that to a political indifference in America. Excuse me. His fences were continually falling to pieces. His cow would either go astray or get among the cabbages. Now it's talking about the breakdown of his property line, but that could also be alluding to border issues as well. And poor agriculture. Weeds were sure to grow quicker in his fields than anywhere else. This is possibly alluding to the general sentiment at the time around British taxation on the American colonists as weeds, essentially. His patrimonial estate, also notice the wording there, patrimonial estate, had dwindled away under his management, acre by acre, until there was little more left than a mere patch of Indian corn and potatoes. Now, this could be referring to what I mentioned earlier, salutary neglect. Now, I have this little snippet right here, courtesy of Jeff Wallenfelt of the Britannica, describing salutary neglect in a very nice, concise way, talking about a period in the mid-18th century where the American colonies weren't really enforced a lot. They were laxly enforced, referring to trade. And because of that period, I remember one of my teachers describing it as, imagine a parent leaving a child alone to do whatever that child wants, and then all of a sudden, a month later, coming back to enforce all these rules. The kid is going to be very upset and not going to adapt very well. That kid could be representing, the American colonists with that, little example. So, now I turn to you. What are your thoughts on the story or the subject of the American Revolution that inspired it? We know that Washington Irving grew up around that time, and he was born when the country was just being started. There was probably a lot of changes happening around where he was. Maybe things weren't all set in stone. But I believe what he's trying to say with this is that Rip Van Winkle is not a character to look up to. He is supposed to be the antithesis of what the American people at that time should have been doing, being politically involved. That way, they could help their country that was just starting out, right? And he also demonstrated that with his actions as well, being so politically involved, whether he was out in Europe or in America as Secretary of Treasury. Could it be motivation based on the people back home maybe becoming complacent? Could it be maybe applauding Rip Van Winkle even for his carefree nature, or chastising him for not caring enough? So I would appreciate if you would leave a comment, kind of just give your idea, what's your take on it. I'm interested to hear what you have to say. Now, that is the end of the literary analysis section, as well as the about the author section. The next section I will be covering, and you can stick around if you would like, is going to be a grammar lesson, grammar and syntax. So, changing gears.